In the very center of Washington, D.C., lies an iconic landscape unlike any other in the world. The United States National Mall and Memorial Parks. Lined by some of the country's most treasured museums, and dotted with monuments to its most revered figures, this 2-mile stretch of national parkland has overcome endless challenges to play an essential role in the American story.
It's the nation's capital, where, you know, the symbol of freedom, and a lot of people take that to heart, and they should, because that's what it is.
The National Mall is a grand public open space that connects and frames the major monuments and symbols of American democracy.
Much like the country itself, the mall has evolved, reflecting our nation's historical journey and adapting to its ever-changing cultural identity.
29 million annual visitors. Half of the American people will visit the National Mall in their lifetime, and it is a pilgrimage.
Over the years, the mall has provided the setting for countless private memories, and for some of America's most defining moments.
I'm a third-generation Washingtonian whose great-grandfather walked off of a slave plantation, and here I was trying to be a part of a great freedom movement.
It was really important for them to have that place of prominence on the mall, which is almost sacred ground to every American. And I think that's part of what was able to start the healing process.
There's only one place where you go to speak truth to power. There's only one place you go to air your grievances in a way that the whole country can engage in, and that's the National Mall.
Public forum, city playground, national park, America's front yard, the United States National Mall.
It's where people come to figure out what the United States is all about. This is where somehow the core identity of this country can be found, here in this one symbolic landscape.
The landscape of the National Mall seems so timeless, so eternal, we forget that it is actually man-made. The more we understand how the mall came to be and how it has changed over the years, the better we understand America's evolution as a nation. Like the country itself, the mall was once much smaller. Part of a capital carved from the wilderness. George Washington himself chose the site for the city and asked a Frenchman named Pierre-Charles L'Enfant to map out a plan.
L'Enfant was a young French artist and engineer, and he came to America to help with the Revolutionary War. And he found himself with one of the history's greatest commissions, design a new capital city for the world's newest empire.
Out of the tidal flats, forest, and farmland, the transplanted Frenchman dreams of a capital to match the young country's ambition. L'Enfant places the new capital's major landmarks on the area's high points.
He came up with a design that put the Capitol building on the highest spot, then called Jenkins Hill, now called Capitol Hill.
L'Enfant takes one look at that and says, that's where the Capitol's going to go. Then he looks across Tiber Creek, and he sees sort of a rise in the land, sort of a bluff almost. And he says, that's where the president's house is going to go.
L'Enfant next reserves another piece of ground within view of both on the eastern bank of the Potomac River, marked with the letter A. Here, he insists, is where a planned monument to George Washington will be built. And connecting the Capitol and his monument to Washington L'Enfant imagined something else. A grand promenade to match the gardens of Versailles, lined by public buildings and a broad canal. L'Enfant's promenade would one day become our national mall.
He was thinking way into the future, and he wanted to establish a kind of order and symbolism that could withstand hundreds of years.
It was a daring dream for a country whose future was very much in doubt. But over the next 200 years, the mall, like the nation itself, would outdo even L'Enfant's vision. The mall's current centerpiece, the Washington Monument, is an extreme case in point. The original design was much more modest, a statue of Washington riding a horse. But today's monument is a stone obelisk over 500 feet tall, made up of nearly 40,000 granite and marble blocks, weighing more than 90,000 tons. It's the tallest freestanding stone structure in the world. The only thing holding these carefully carved stones together is their weight. For more than 100 years, this ancient building technique has withstood everything nature has thrown its way, including a tower's greatest enemy.
We're following breaking news right now out of Washington, D.C., where an earthquake has been felt in the D.C. area.
August 2011.
The light fixtures were swinging and the building shook, according to
a 5.8 magnitude earthquake, the strongest in more than a century, rocks Washington, D.C. For visitors near the top of the Washington Monument, 50 stories in the air, it's over a minute of terror as the monument sways back and forth. Fortunately, no lives are lost. But there are over 150 cracks on the mall's most visible icon. If they're not found and repaired, lethal chunks of stone could break loose and fall to the ground below.
Or of the crack directly above me, this is the large crack on the west elevation.
If the cracks aren't sealed, rainwater and ice will make them worse. It's just the latest challenge facing a monument that struggled from the very beginning to be built, and a mall that serves more people and more purposes every day. In the early years of the 19th century, as the capital and the country struggled to define themselves, the mall exists only on paper. The spot reserved for Washington's monument stands empty. Then, an ambitious new plan, inspired by the 100-year anniversary of Washington's birth, calls for a memorial modeled on the obelisks of ancient Egypt. Designed to be the tallest man-made structure on Earth, the monument will declare to the world that America stands alongside history's greatest civilizations. But just 6 years after construction begins, as the nation slides toward civil war, the privately funded project runs out of money, and the monument grinds to a halt, 150 feet in the air.
It did look really terrible during the Civil War. It was up on top of this scrubby little hill right on the edge of the river. It looks like an industrial chimney in the middle of Washington, D.C. Very few people could visualize that this thing would ever be finished or ever look decent in any way.
Here's something that was supposed to be built for the father of our country, and we can't build it because we don't have a united country. We have a divided country. And it's a real symbol of the fact that we can't proceed. We can't proceed as a country. You can't proceed with that monument.
The mall around the monument has lost its way too. Its grounds clogged with encampments, hospital tents, and cattle pens. The broad canal, now a fetid, diseased sewer. And at the eastern end of the mall, the dome of the U.S. Capitol is also unfinished. But one Washington resident understands the negative symbolism of such chaos, and President Abraham Lincoln is determined to do something about it. While the war rages on, Lincoln fights to keep construction on the Capitol building going, a clear sign that the Union will survive. And in December 1863, the Statue of Freedom is placed atop the completed Capitol dome. But work on the rest of the mall and the Washington Monument will have to wait. The 5.8 magnitude earthquake that rattled the mall forces the Washington Monuments to close. From a series of platforms that reach to the very top, workers see firsthand how the earthquake jarred the 130-year-old structure, held in place solely by its own weight.
During the earthquake, the monument shook hard enough to shift all these corners of the monument, which is really amazing. This stone here basically shifted that way and out this way, about 3/4 of an inch. There's no repair to it. It's all because of the weight and where it is. If it was like a top stone, maybe, but right in the middle, it'd be like taking down a tower or Lincoln Logs.
The monument requires 2.5 miles of new sealant placed between the stones, and many cracks call for extensive repairs.
All this was damaged practically, so we took out all the damage, try to save as much as possible of the original, and we put a new piece in to make it look a lot better and last a lot longer than just patching it up.
Workers will craft more than 100 new marble inserts to fit seamlessly into the monument wall.
Put it in. Okay, that is just right.
The damage done in just over a minute takes nearly 2 years and $15 million to repair. But persistence and slow progress have long been the hallmarks of the mall and its monuments. After sitting unfinished for 24 years, work on the Washington Monument starts up again in 1878, when a reunified country is finally ready to honor its first president. Heading the construction is a 47-year-old Civil War veteran and Army Corps of Engineer Lieutenant Colonel named Thomas Lincoln Casey. Right away, Casey faces a visible challenge. The stone blocks already there come from a quarry in Maryland that's run out of usable rock. And the best new marble available is a different shade. Casey cares about color, but his bigger priority is getting high-quality stones strong enough to bear thousands of tons of weight.
He's not Mr. Aesthetics, he's Mr. Engineer. So he says, okay, get the marble and let's start moving.
And move they did. As the obelisk rises, stone by stone, ideas about its final design swirl in the popular press and Congress. But Thomas Lincoln Casey envisions a completely spare and abstract obelisk towering over the mall. As Congress debates various elaborate designs, Casey's crew simply keeps working.
Nobody in Congress could agree on how the monument should be redesigned. And Casey also understood this. He understood that they would never come to an agreement. So the only way the monument was going to be built was if he did it, and did it his way.
Casey followed the Egyptian formula that the height of the obelisk must be 10 times the width of its base. Since the base was already 55 feet and 1.5 inches wide, the final height is 555 feet, 5 1/8 inches. After just 6 years, the capstone is placed on Casey's creation. The simple, massive obelisk rising over the emerging capital is the tallest structure in the world. And a country finding stability has a monument befitting its growing power.
It's a sign of a creation of a country that is going to stand for something. There's nothing like it in the world because there's nothing like the United States in the world. I mean, this is a democracy. It got through a civil war. It restored itself. All that is poured into the monument.
Today, the view from the top of the Washington Monument showcases the grandeur and design of the mall below. But when early visitors looked down, they saw a very different landscape. One many believed did not live up to its potential.
The mall was a mess. This grand expanse had been broken up, had been divided up, had been built over. There was no unity to it.
Where L'Enfant had envisioned a great national promenade, the area between the Capitol and the Washington Monument is a mixture of trees, meandering pathways, and open spaces. Instead of centers of learning and embassies, neighborhoods, some of the roughest in Washington, line its borders. And cutting across the mall itself, the rail lines of the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad. And a project to dredge the Potomac River and rid the city of its malaria-infested, flood-prone tidal flats creates a landfill at the mall's western end that extends a full mile beyond the Washington Monument. In the early 1900s, with the United States in ascendance and Washington, D.C. starting to resemble the great capital of L'Enfant's dream, a new plan emerges to radically restructure the mall. Created by a Senate commission made up of America's leading planners and architects and chaired by Senator James McMillan, this new design signals an intention to return to L'Enfant's original vision of clean, straight lines and an emphasis on national symbolism. It is in this McMillan plan that we recognize the mall of today, with the Washington Monument at its center, and on the newly created expanse to the west, a monument conceived to honor the only president who compares in greatness with Washington.
At one end, we have the seat of government, the Capitol. In the middle, we have the father of that government, George Washington. And at the other end, we have the preserver of that government, the preserver of the Union, Abraham Lincoln.
Perhaps no place on the mall has a more powerful impact on visitors than the Lincoln Memorial. They may not know it, but that effect was carefully planned and carried out by the architect, Henry Bacon. Professor Chris Thomas is one of the world's leading experts on the Lincoln Memorial and is still impressed by the forethought of its creator.
The steps are intentionally long and high, both to lift the memorial high in the air so that it can be seen from a distance, and also so that the climb is itself somewhat arduous. Once inside the memorial, the architect and the sculptor hoped visitors would first commune with Mr. Lincoln as a person, as though still living in that central chamber. Then you are intended to go into the side chambers and slowly, reflectively read the words of his great addresses, to reflect upon the ideals for which he lived and died.
From a distance, the Lincoln Memorial looks like an ancient temple sitting on a hill. But it's all an illusion. The ground it seems to be resting on is actually unstable landfill, far too soft to support the building's massive weight. Below the crowd-filled memorial grounds lies a whole other world, and the secret to its stability. With Park Service archaeologist Bob Sonderman as his guide, Chris Thomas is exploring these chambers for the first time.
One of the other things I think is fascinating is just looking at all these poured concrete forms and how they designed the superstructure to support the whole thing. Because, you know, much of this ground here is not fast land, it's kind of soupy.
Borrowing from newly developed bridge and skyscraper construction methods, Bacon devises an ingenious way to build a 38,000-ton structure on landfill. He anchors the foundation by driving hollow steel tubes into the bedrock below, using massive concrete blocks to push the tubes through 50 feet of mud and sand. After filling those tubes with concrete, Bacon extends the columns another 50 feet above the ground.
So here we are in the upper foundations, great cavity. They call this space the Undercroft.
The Undercroft, right.
And this is really awe-inspiring, like a modern-day cathedral.
The arch ceiling above is actually the floor of the memorial.
Here's where you really get a sense of the fact that the Lincoln Memorial is not a temple resting on a stone hilltop like
right.
the
Parthenon or something like that.
Exactly, like the Parthenon in Athens.
When the foundation was finished, the builders laid the cornerstone for the temple itself. And for 7 years, the mass of marble and granite went up. The hill the Lincoln Memorial seems to sit on is merely landscaping, concealing the modern steel and concrete supports below. The area under the memorial reveals more than just the secret of its true construction.
Let me show you this over here.
On these walls, graffiti, like prehistoric cave paintings, offers evidence of the people who worked here.
You've got these great caricatures that are chalked on, probably charcoal drawings, but you can see this guy kind of looks like a foreman, got a cute little mustache, he's smoking a cigarette, and he's got his hands on his hips, so he's directing somebody.
I wonder if this could just possibly be the architect, Henry Bacon. He looked not unlike that, and we know that he smoked heavily.
While many photos of the site exist, few capture Bacon there. This crude drawing may be one of the only close-ups of the architect in the field. In these images, we see glimpses of workers dwarfed by the scale of their surroundings. In these drawings, the builders leave their mark, the building site, and a bit of the world through their eyes. The Lincoln Memorial was finished in 1922. The dedication, like the monument itself, a mix of a bygone era and the modern age. The new technology of film captured the event for posterity, while the memories of Lincoln and America's brutal conflict still burned in the hearts of some in attendance.
Very few Civil War veterans were still alive. Lincoln's son, Robert, was still alive and attended. But this was just about the last time that those who could remember the war could be at such an occasion. By all accounts, the ceremony was deeply moving and affecting.
In the years to come, this great memorial and the mall itself will provide a national stage for more important gatherings. A place not only to look back, but to push forward for American ideals. With the Lincoln Memorial on the western end of the mall, in line with the Washington Monument and the Capitol, the McMillan Plan now called for one more memorial to complete the symbolic symmetry of the new landscape. This one to be placed on the mall's southern edge across from the White House. In a world threatened by fascism, President Franklin Roosevelt pushed for a memorial to Thomas Jefferson, a man whose words captured the American aspirations of freedom. But Jefferson was neither the first nor the most beloved resident of the mall's tidal basin. Every spring, 1.5 million people flock here to see nearly 4,000 Japanese cherry trees erupt into bloom. It's the most popular annual event on the mall. Behind this spectacle is the unsung work of the National Mall's arborists. Today's the day before peak bloom, the culmination of 3 months of work dedicated almost exclusively to the prized cherry blossoms, and the last chance of the year for this crew to fine-tune their masterwork.
We normally start pruning them like the second, third week of January, and we prune them, as you see, all the way up until the point when they're just about to be peak bloom. And then at that point, we just back out of the way and let the visitors have their day.
How's this old baby doing, Martin?
Gig Shoup is the second generation of his family to tend to these trees.
My father happened to work here since 1965 to 2000, so I knew his generation and mine, so.
Gig's team, Gig's father, and those before them have managed a remarkable feat.
How old is that tree?
It's probably one of the original trees, which was
1912.
1912.
Wow, beautiful.
So,
It's going to live a long time, isn't it?
we hope so. That's why we're here. Yeah, have a good day.
About 100 of these trees have been here for more than a century, almost double the cherry tree's average lifespan. They're here because a small group of well-connected Washingtonians, passionate about Japanese cherry trees, fought to have this area set aside as a vast blooming grove. Today's cherry blossoms are part of a success story that began in near disaster. Touched by the Americans' love of their delicate trees, Japan sent an original shipment as a token of goodwill. But when the trees arrived in January of 1910, they were infested and diseased. Agriculture officials were forced to destroy them. Thankfully, the Japanese ambassador sent a second shipment of 3,000 trees. This time, they thrived. Immigrants from a distant land taking root in American soil, enhancing the power and beauty of our National Mall. Gig and his National Park Service team work to keep all the trees, the originals still left, and those that came after, healthy and blooming. Despite the burden of millions of people moving over their roots and picnicking beneath their boughs.
30-mile-an-hour winds and 20 degrees. There's other places you'd rather be, but I don't know, it's like a pretty woman. No matter how mad you get at her, she's still pretty. You might be mad at her, but it is what it is. It's a beautiful thing.
As the National Mall took shape, it succeeded in capturing the imagination of the American public. Visiting the mall became a kind of pilgrimage, a place for families and school groups to feel the greatness of the nation. But as the long vistas and impressive memorials added to the mall's symbolic power, something unexpected happened.
What they didn't realize is that by clearing the mall, clearing the trees out, they created a giant empty space that could be filled with protesters.
The people began claiming the mall as their own. A rallying place to gather and to be heard. One protest in particular set the standard for others to follow.
August 28th, 1963. I had been in the South working with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and got a call saying, there's a go for the march. Do you want to be involved? And there I was, whoops, up from Mississippi to New York, helping with the staff work that organized the march in Washington.
In 1963, civil rights leaders fed up with conditions across the country called for a massive protest march on the National Mall.
The march really was the culmination of 10 years of civil rights marches and struggles in the South. We had struggled in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, North and South Carolina, Texas, all over the South. But how were we to bring that together, and what were we really after? Well, the only way to really get what we were after was to somehow bring those marches to Washington.
On the morning of August 28, 1963, cars and buses full of marchers filled the roads to Washington. There had been other marches on the mall before this one, but never anything on this scale. Millions tuning in by television witnessed a remarkable sight. 250,000 Americans, blacks and whites, marching peacefully together towards the iconic backdrop of the Lincoln Memorial.
I recall standing on the steps, and as far back as I could see, I could not see the last person. That's when I knew it was a success beyond our wildest dreams. You couldn't help but be impressed with the demeanor of the march, the calm of the march. With the speakers at the march, by the time they got to Martin Luther King, I said, how in the world could Martin Luther King have anything else to say? And I'll be darned if he didn't.
score years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free.
The 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was the biggest gathering of its type ever seen on the Mall to that point.
The spirit kind of came over everybody, and there was joy. There was delight that there were so many of us. And they say, do you see this? I mean, we were impressed. So we hoped everybody else would be.
That day helped to change America. And it helped to transform the Mall from a place honoring individual greatness with magnificent memorials to a space recognizing the contributions and sacrifices of everyday citizens. More and more Americans were demanding to be included in America's story and to have their voices heard on the National Mall. Standing apart in a quiet corner of the mall, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial has always been a special place. A simple black stone wall, engraved with over 58,000 names of those who died, dedicated not to one great general, but to every fallen soldier.
The wall is completely different from anything else on the mall. One thing that's very striking is that as you see people going down the wall, they don't speak. There's a silence. It's a communion with the people on the wall.
It was a design that provoked the same conflicting emotions as the Vietnam War itself.
The wall began in controversy. I mean, it was a monument like no other.
Some called it the Black Gash of Shame. But since its dedication in 1982, it's been embraced by friends and family, strangers and schoolchildren, transforming the mall into a place where history becomes personal and the personal becomes eternal. From the day it opened, people interacted with the wall in a direct way. Many felt compelled to leave things behind.
Objects start appearing along the bottom of the wall, and the objects are American flags, packages of cigarettes, cans of beer.
Some of the objects are ordinary, some extraordinary, all made sacred by the simple gesture of placing them at the wall.
Nobody is expecting this. There's no provision for it. The first ranger who picks the first objects up has the sense to say, we can't throw this away.
With the items piling up, the National Park Service had to act. Realizing that these offerings were now a part of the memorial itself, the Park Service moved to save them for posterity.
Everything in here is precious to someone. You don't find things made of precious metals, but they're precious because it meant something to that individual. The Vietnam War did not just impact service members. It also had an impact upon the family, upon the friends, associates. This collection, it runs the gamut of all the human emotions. That's why this collection is so important.
In 30 years, they've collected amazing things. Over 400,000 items.
You really get a snapshot into people's lives, people's emotions. The wall and this collection were really fundamental in the healing process of the Vietnam War. And it was a place for a lot of veterans to come and get closure over scars that they had held on to for 30, 40, 50 years. And you see that every day reflected in the artifacts.
The curators work 40 hours a week, cataloging every single item that comes through the door. And each has its power. But once in a while, the staff comes across something truly exceptional. On Memorial Day 2013, a simple plastic bag was left at the base of the wall.
We weren't expecting anything special when we found it. It was all placed in this blue album cover. But once we opened it and started going through it, we really realized that we had something special. It's probably the most complete portrait we have of the life of someone who is on the wall.
But who left the scrapbook and why?
Most of our offerings come completely anonymous, but in this case, the person who brought it to the wall left us a letter explaining the circumstance in which he found it.
Ken Hamilton is a 24-year Army veteran who did 2 tours in Iraq. He and his wife live in Toms River, New Jersey.
This is the place where I found the items. All the boxes were here piled up at the curbside for garbage pickup, right here. I looked into the boxes, and that's where I could see there was some military items there, a soldier's picture, a scrapbook, and some letters. And I knew that this soldier was from Vietnam, and I knew that he had been wounded in combat. And being a soldier myself, I didn't want them to go into the landfill, and I knew that I should bring them home and talk to my wife, and maybe we could find a place to bring these items.
And I started looking through, and I couldn't believe that Bruce's whole life was in the book, and that my husband found it and brought it home. We sat and we talked and pondered over it. I said, well, it's time to take it to the wall, because that's where it belongs.
The scrapbook told the story of a 19-year-old soldier named Bruce Peteroy from Staten Island, New York.
We get to see what we believe is a family photo, possibly of him and his parents and his brother.
He was drafted into the Army in 1968. In October, less than 3 months into his tour, Peteroy was wounded.
Dear Mom, you know, taking care of myself, don't worry, I promise I'm resting and I'm treating myself well. We have a matchbook from a club in Okinawa.
In Okinawa, Bruce met a woman, fell in love, and got engaged. By February 1969, he was back in Vietnam. On May 10th, he wrote his mother a letter. He's been in the bush for 25 days straight.
It talks about his fiancée and really tells his mom that this is the one, Mom, she's the most important, and I'm bringing her home to meet you. And unfortunately, neither he nor his fiancée ever made it back to the United States.
Two days after writing the letter, at 4:45 a.m., Bruce Peteroy was killed in an ambush. It was a week before his 21st birthday.
It's a soul up on that wall, not just a name, not just a number. It's a family member, a brother, a sister, an aunt, an uncle, a son, a daughter.
The wall gives a voice to those who died. It provides a place for loved ones to memorialize their own. And it is home to those that might have otherwise been forgotten. No other place in America inspires such deeply personal moments and invites such grand public demonstrations as the National Mall. And for one group on the other side of the country, the vast space became a place for both. San Francisco, 1987. A deadly disease was sweeping through neighborhoods like the Castro.
You could tell the neighborhood was dying. You could walk down Castro Street and you would see people who had lost 30 pounds, and then 2 weeks later you wouldn't see them.
HIV/AIDS was already an epidemic, but there was no public outcry.
The country was not ready to deal with AIDS. AIDS was something that happened to other people. The classic lines were homosexuals, Haitians, and hemophiliacs. And if you weren't any of those, this wasn't your problem. We needed to find a way to have Middle America think of this as us instead of them.
They did it by making a quilt.
This is number 4. This is one of the very earliest ones. We could have called it a protest banner. We didn't. It was a quilt. You say the word quilt and you think of your grandmother taking care of you when you're sick. You think of chicken soup. And that's what we really needed.
A patchwork of 3x6 panels, dedicated not to the number of people dead from AIDS, but to their lives.
Somebody probably chose those fabrics or colors for a reason, and each block kind of tells a story the same way every section of the quilt tells a story.
It was to be called the Names Project. And to reach the American public, there was only one place they could take it.
There's only one place where you go to speak truth to power. There's only one place you go to air your grievances in a way that the whole country can engage in, and that's the National Mall.
From a storefront in the Castro, the idea of an AIDS quilt became a reality.
We started getting panels from moms in Kansas City and from families in Minneapolis who had made the panel around the kitchen table and put it in an envelope and mailed it off to some guys in the Castro they didn't know. And by the time we got to Washington, it wasn't the Castro trying to be heard. It was the whole country sewn together, literally, on the mall.
John Ferreira, Michael DeSantis.
On October 11, 1987, the day of the Gay and Lesbian March on Washington, volunteers began to unfold the quilt.
Phil Harrington, Bill Hart.
Nearly 2,000 panels, representing less than 10% of those Americans dead from AIDS at that time.
Roger McCoy, James Mincy.
We had no idea how people were going to react. As daylight came, there were 1,000 people or so around the perimeter of the quilt. Everyone who was there because either they'd made a panel or someone had told them that they'd made a panel for someone and they were coming to find it.
John W. Keller.
The gay community did not have a national space to rally around, so they used the mall to create one.
Tony Crematus.
The reaction to that single event, that one day of the quilt on the mall, blew us away.
This huge quilt that today is being spread out on the Capitol Mall in Washington has 2,000 panels, every one crafted by the friends and relatives of an AIDS victim.
It happened almost instantly, that the country kind of got it. Overnight, the media changed their whole tone around HIV. And it wasn't about these other people. It was a personal story in just about every paper of a grieving person who went to Washington to pay homage to their dead son or their dead brother on our nation's front yard.
Over the years, the quilt returned to the mall, helping to humanize the AIDS epidemic for the entire nation. And by 1996, 45,000 panels of quilt stretched from the Washington Monument to the Capitol building.
It's a mile from the Washington Monument to the Capitol. It's a mile. And it looked almost like we had just literally unrolled a carpet right up the steps of the Capitol. There was no way You could not look out from the Capitol and say, oh my God, have we got a problem? I don't think we could have found any venue other than the mall that would have catapulted HIV and people dying of AIDS onto the national agenda like the National Mall. You needed someplace that everybody owns a piece of, and that's really only the mall.
For as long as this country endures, the National Mall will continue to evolve along with it, maintaining its grounds, preserving its monuments, and shaping its identity will present an ever-changing challenge. Because the National Mall is not only the nation's front yard, it's also the nation's mirror, reflecting the values and conflicts of the time.
The National Mall really is about coming together. And I think people who want to better understand our values, want to understand the symbolism and the history of our country. And that's all represented on the National Mall.
By some combination of accident and design, the mall has become the ideal place for public protest, quiet reflection, and for joyous celebration.
Happy 4th of July!
People come here and they're in good moods and they want to celebrate all that's great about America.
What could be a better setting than sitting in front of the Lincoln Memorial and waiting for fireworks?
To be at the nation's capital celebrating Independence Day is definitely different energy, you know, a lot of excitement there. Like, this is where everything comes from, and you know, this is sort of like the hub of celebration.
And through all the changes, something essential endures. Something as American, awe-inspiring, and delightful as fireworks on the 4th of July. To learn more about this program, visit pbs.org.